Rachel Reeves is getting ready to announce her much anticipated spending review. But apparently all is not well with some of her Labour colleagues, with the Deputy Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and some backbench MPs unhappy at the Chancellor's decisions. And we'll also be reflecting on an interesting week for reform. Welcome to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
So welcome to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast and this new format where we're going to talk all things domestic politics on a Monday, and then Tuesday turn our attention to geopolitics, and lots going on, of course, in the States at the moment. But let's start with the UK, and a big week this week for Rachel Reeves. She's got her spending review to announce, as is always the way with these things. Lots of leaks happening, and apparently not all sweetness and light behind the scenes, because we are told this morning that Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, is yet to do her deal with the Chancellor. So we wait to see how that sorts itself out. We've also, of course, had a by-election in Scotland, which, if you read the headlines in the press, you may assume Reform won. But actually, it was a Labour victory, and it was a surprise Labour victory, and an impressive Labour victory, in my opinion. But we'll get into that in a second, because I know that the BBC believe that Reform won that election as well. So I'm sure Jim will have a word or two to say on that. And then sticking with Reform, again, if we think that the Labour Party are having some domestic travails, well, they've had the chairman resign and then return to the party about 48 hours later, which seems a bit ridiculous, really. And as I say, tomorrow we'll be looking at all things in terms of that other big major fallout that happened politically this week between the President of the United States and the richest man in the world. But let's start at home and with this spending review. And Rachel Reeves has got a tough challenge on her hands, guys, because she wants to spend big on health. She's got to spend big on defence. She's got herself into this straitjacket of no tax increases. And I think it would be a difficult sell anyway for her to increase taxes, given where the tax take is at this moment in time and what she did last year. And she's now allegedly or reportedly having some problems with her Home Secretary, because, of course, one of the places that she's looking to save money is apparently policing. And I'm sure that's gone down like a cup of cold sick with Yvette Cooper. So let's start with this 30 billion a year by 2028 spend on the NHS. What do you make of that, Joe? Is that essential? Is it needed? Is it something that you think, well, it's a Labour government, it's inevitable?
A bit of all of those things, I think, Frank. You can pour money into the NHS until there's no more money left, and it probably won't change that much. I think the real question is whether Wes Streeting can push through the reforms that are needed. And a lot of that is going digital. I mean, the money that the health service spends on post, which is utterly ludicrous, and how many people get the letter saying that their appointment's been cancelled 3 days after they've been to the appointment, which they were told about in a text and an email and a phone call anyway. So there's lots of efficiencies. But of course, if you say efficiencies, people think that means job cuts. I don't think it does, actually, in the health service. I think it means linking things up digitally, about being much more technologically focused, about making sure that you are sweating the assets of laboratories for blood tests and x-rays and everything else, and working around the clock, which many, many hospitals are. And they are also using private facilities to get through patients with relatively minor things like cataract surgery and that sort of stuff. So I think that's, if he can use them, if the money can be used to retain and recruit staff, that's great. If it can also be used to transform the way the NHS works, that's even better. But the big elephant in the room of this is about preventative medicine and preventative health. One of the things that we know all too well is the biggest indicator of bad health and bad health outcomes is poverty. You know, bad housing, bad air quality, bad diet, lack of exercise, all of those things. You can't, you know, fix a hospital unless you fix the homes that people live in. So I think that's a really, really big challenge. And at the same time, the government has announced rather quietly that it's going to stop giving universities the extra funding for nurse training, which seems utterly bonkers because it means we are more and more reliant on nurses from other countries.
I don't think that this has been looked at strategically enough in some senses, because I think you're right, Joe, in terms of how we start to improve the health of the nation, then actually poverty is the obvious place where you've got to start. And let's be fair, the government announced a really innovative project last week. 50,000 kids now who were not getting free school meals are, as from now, which I think is a great move and properly targeted at people who need it. Because
I think it's 100,000, Frank.
Is it 100,000?
Yes, more.
And I think that was, you know, again, these are the sort of, okay, incremental, but changes that are required if Labour is to deliver on some of the commitments it's made. But my big fear, Jim, is that this 30 billion is going in on a day when we've got announcements of doctors potentially striking, nurses voting to potentially strike. And of course, what we applauded the health secretary in his first couple of weeks of office was the fact that he got these strikes settled quickly so that the NHS could begin to get back on track. But what you were concerned about at the time, I have to confess, was that those pay increases have been given without any real reforms or acceptance from them that, well, this is it, and then going forward it will be the pay review that makes a decision, you know, the independent pay reviewer who makes the decision on your pay increases. So if the doctors and nurses go on strike, Jim, or either one of those groups of people go on strike, then 30 billion ain't going to touch the sides, is it?
Yeah, I share both of your lack of confidence that this 30 billion, which is an extraordinary award. I mean, Streeting has really taken home the cream with this. Well, as you say, both the Home Secretary and indeed the Deputy Prime Minister, as we speak, are still not settled, and they're clearly unhappy. But obviously there's been some sort of trade-off to give this enormous amount to the NHS at the possible expense of, because the opposition parties are already saying that police numbers are going to fall. And to make that decision is quite extraordinary. But the point that you make concerns me as well. What conditions are going to be applied to the release of this money? Because if it's just handed over, the paper letters will continue to flow. I think that I can't imagine what the relations are between the government and the BMA, which is led by quite left-wing leadership. You know, I think the government must feel really let down that, having settled without condition immediately on taking office, they're now faced with the threat of strikes again. And I think, you know, potentially they'll have to stand up to the resident doctors, and indeed the nurses. I mean, the nurses. I mean, obviously this decision to cut nurse training, which will have a big impact in the Northwest. I mean, the teaching hospitals in Manchester train a huge number of these nurses, but you know, the government have really got to try and get, before they release the money, they've got to get these changes made. And you know, with AI, we can talk about AI in other contexts and its malevolent properties, but in terms of matching up our medical records and things like that, that is clearly the way forward. And I'm sure Wes Streeting wants to do that with the help of Peter Kyle, the technology secretary, who he's very close to get those things done. But I agree with you, Frank. I don't see the full vision of that. But maybe in the speech on Wednesday, Rachel Reeves will outline the conditions under which this money is given.
Well, I hope so, because without a modernisation agenda alongside that award, then it would be a total nonsense. And we've been talking for 30 years about people matching up medical records. This isn't new. You know, the fact that all of a sudden we've got this thing called AI. Woo, whoopee-doo, this is going to revolutionise the health service. We've got systems in place now that could have basically been utilised to modernise the health service, and there is resistance from the health service. Let's be honest, they don't want to share information. They don't really want to change working conditions, which would help. GPs are still stuck back in the 1950s in terms of the way in which they operate, and it's a scandal. And, you know, I also haven't sat on a number of health boards as a non-exec director for a number of years, know that there is millions of pounds worth of waste in the National Health Service, and often it is on people, I'm afraid, Joe, because it's people who describe them as middle managers. In terms of where reform can go with this, if there isn't a huge improvement over the next 3 or 4 years, well, you know, you could spend. Honestly, Elon Musk would have a field day in the NHS,
absolutely.
In terms of
Absolutely.
Jones, because the number of people in there who you do wonder what the fuck you're doing, other than saying no.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that, as Jim said, let's wait and see what happens on Wednesday. But the great thing about the investment that was made back in the 90s and the early noughties was that at least Blair was talking a good game in terms of reform in the NHS, and some reforms were made. Of course, in the end, Alan Milburn got burnt by Gordon Brown. Nevertheless, there was a clear intention there. As I said in my early remarks, Joe, I'm not quite sure what the strategy here is, because if we're taking money, for example, from Angela Rayner and her housing programme, then that's not going to help sort the poverty situation out, is it?
No, exactly. And, you know, we say it time and time again, what about social care? Because unless you deal with that, you know, and I've said it before, but I am one of millions of people in this country. My mother is in a care home, £7,000 a month it's costing, you know, and the people who are making money, they're not the carers who are seeing to her, they are the hedge funds and the investment groups who see this as a money-making machine, and they're keeping people alive. That's a whole different argument, but people whose quality of life is very, very poor. Now, you know, not everybody can afford that sort of money. Councils certainly can't. So unless you deal with social care and enable older people or people with disabilities or health limiting conditions to be able to be at home, whether that's with community nursing or occupational therapy or modifications to their home, you're going to end up with those people in hospital. Then you can't get the people off the ambulances to get into hospital, and then you end up with the crisis again. And it does seem to me that, you know, Wes Streeting, I think, he's got the will. I don't know whether he's got the political backing from people within those vested interests, which could be unions, could be the middle management, as you say, Frank, to actually say, right, we need to change this. We need to actually keep people out of hospital. So that means this money is going to be spent in the community, for instance. Yeah. But, you know, if he doesn't mention social care, I think the government is doing a great disservice.
And councils, of course, facing cuts as well, which they'll be delighted about. But let's move the debate on a little, because the other big pressure she's got, which she couldn't have foreseen necessarily before the election, is this requirement now to spend at least 3% of GDP at some point on defence. That's going to take a big chunk of a budget as well, Jim. And of course, Pete Hesketh was at the UN this week from the United States, demanding 5% GDP spend from the NATO allies. So this is an additional pressure, as I say, that you've got to look at the world situation at the moment and say it's a sensible spend. Nonetheless, it's something that Rachel Reeves hadn't budgeted for, because actually Labour's manifesto commits the government to a 2.5% spend in this parliament. So problems for her there as well, Jim.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we sort of think, arguing about 2.5% going up to 3%, well, that doesn't seem like very much, but I think it's about £10 billion per 0.5% or something like that. So we're talking big potatoes here.
Yeah, it's 24 billion a year if we assume a 3% target.
Yeah.
24 billion.
Yeah, I mean, just in parenthesis, when I was reporting at the beginning of the Second World War, our spending on defence went up to 50, from about 10% to 50% by 1940-41. So that just tells you what, and that is part of the argument, of course, that because there are tensions within the Labour Party about this. How has it come to this, that we're putting two child benefit, and perhaps we can discuss whether she's going to give way on that, because there was an interesting poll yesterday which showed that public opinion is not in favour of ending the 2 child benefit cap.
We'll come on to benefits.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. So there are tensions in the Labour Party about spending all this money on guns and bullets, and in many ways I share it. I never thought that I would live to see this, because we all know it's just it's an obvious fact that it's such a waste of, when we've got so many challenges facing mankind, that we're wasting all this money on drones and weapons and things like that. Nevertheless, if we're going to even attempt to keep the United States interested in Europe, we're going to have to listen to what Hesketh and people say, and it's obviously put a huge strain on her, she's had to respond to this. But what it all means in the autumn, because this is the spending review, what people are already beginning to say is the sort of the tax implications of this may not be noticed until the autumn.
I just wonder whether she couldn't do what Germany has done, which is basically to break their own rules in order to borrow money for defence. Which I know we're not part of the EU, sadly, anymore. But there must be a way around this. I mean, I just think in terms of public opinion, you can probably sell to most people the need to be better able to defend the country, because war is more likely than not.
But does she start off market jitters by doing that? That's the problem.
That's the problem. But there's another point that you start off market jitters, but you actually say, but look at the jobs it's going to create. I mean, I'm with you, Jim. The idea that you've got a Labour government cutting foreign aid but spending money on defence, and then arguing, oh, but we can't get rid of these, making bombs because it creates jobs. All of those things are sort of neither here nor there. The truth of the matter is that we've got a war on mainland Europe. We've got Russia very aggressive, and the threat is very real, whether it is obvious or more insidious. But I do think, she has got the wiggle room to say, right, we are now in a separate thing. And so the defence increase could almost be a ring-fence borrowing. I mean, that might sound bonkers, but that's what Germany's done.
Yeah, I think the problem is, because I've made that point, as you would have thought, to a number of ministers. Of course, Germany's borrowing is nowhere near the rate of the UK. No. It's about 60% of GDP, whereas ours already is 100%. And as the Americans are going to find out, and we'll discuss this tomorrow, if you add to your debt, then interest rates go through the roof, and we're already spending billions of pounds just on interest on the money that we borrowed, largely through the financial crash, and then of course through COVID. And it's the lockdowns and COVID that continue to plague governments, actually, because when you make that point, Jim, warfare or welfare is the way it's been put in some circles, then you then turn your attention to the welfare budget. And I was astonished at these figures, which I only learned last week. Pre-COVID, we were spending about £8 billion a year on supporting people who were not in work. Do you know what the figure is now? 49 billion. Mm-hmm. 41 billion pounds more than pre-COVID levels, more than half of which is going to support people who are signed off work with mental illness. Now, I can't think of anything worse for somebody who's mentally ill than telling them, we'll support you to stay at home and be isolated. Surely the best way of supporting people with mental health difficulties, two things actually. One is to try and get them back into employment. Secondly, it's to invest some of that £49 billion, probably £1 billion a do, to significantly increase your mental health services. But honestly, Jim, £49 billion, it's simply not sustainable. And all that Rachel Reeves is talking about is cutting 5 billion from that 49 billion. Now, some of it I think is controversial around PIPs and people who've got things like long COVID, for example. But if you look at that figure, surely common sense tells you that that is a figure that we cannot simply continue to pay if we want the country to recover.
Yes, absolutely. And we now enter a very sensitive discussion because, there is a view that the COVID experience either knocked the confidence or the isolation, changed people's attitude about whether they want to go into work and all this sort of stuff. And, how many people are, let's have the discussion, are pretending that they've got mental health issues, because this is the conversation that goes on away from sort of polite podcasts. A lot of people think that figure that you've just illustrated is just not credible, and that there are people who are making excuses and are being presumably signed off by doctors who are not applying their professional integrity to actually say, no, I do not believe that you're suffering from mental problems. I can't explain that increase without there being an element of that within it. Now, that said, social media, the pressures of unemployment, are tipping a lot of people over the edge. And you're absolutely right that we need to have better mental services. And just reverting to our previous conversation, I hope that this 30 billion that's going into the NHS is partly going to go into the strategy of getting people back to work. The NHS's role in getting people back to work is part of the money of that 30 billion is going to be spent on.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, Jim. I mean, let me just put this into context as well. That's 49 billion to support people who are not in work, to support people who are not in work. The forecast by 2030, the welfare bill overall, this is eye-watering stuff, actually, will be £378 billion. Rachel Reeves trying to cut 5 billion of that, and the left and the Labour Party going fucking nuts. I mean, you just cannot continue to spend those amounts of money on welfare and expect your country to stay a first world country, I'm afraid. You're going to slip into huge recession, big problems. We can't, and every time.
But what do you guys say to my claim that a lot of these people are swinging the lead and they need to be?
I agree with you, Jim. I think you're right, and I think that again, you can't look back because there's no point in a sense, but you will know how I was raging at the number of times we locked down in this country. It was ridiculous. And not only were we locking down, we were giving people 80% of their wages to sit at home, allowing them not to pay the mortgage at the same time. And then we wonder 2 years later why people don't want to go back to work. And not only have we got a problem with those people who've got mental illness, some of whom, as you rightly say, Jim, are being signed off work long-term by GPs who are not qualified to sign them off. They're not fucking psychiatrists. They're GPs. So these people, most of them, have never been near a psychiatrist. They've never had a proper assessment as to whether they're mentally ill or not. And if they've been sat at home for 5 years now, chances are they are. They have got anxiety, they have got problems, but letting them stay at home and paying them to do so is bad for them and bad for our economy. But Labour and its MPs are not supporting Rachel Reeves in even tackling this on the edges, Joe. That's the challenge she's got.
Yeah, well, they're frightened, and that is the problem. There was a very interesting interview, I don't know if either of you heard it, yesterday with Ken Clarke. And he was sort of giving advice to Keir Starmer, which was be unpopular. Margaret Thatcher was Be unpopular, but do what you need to do, because at the end of the parliament, you will be judged on how successful. But all the time you're frightened, and you're frightened about what the Daily Mail or the Express or, opposition parties say, or people within your own party, you will never be bold enough. And the other side of this welfare coin, if you like, is that there will be growing resentment amongst people who are having to work longer and longer, well into their 60s and perhaps into their 70s, and paying tax to support people who are at home because they've got a low mood. Now, that is not to in any way disparage real mental health issues. But the problem is that we've got into this thing of medicalising absolutely everything.
Yeah.
Everybody needs to have a label, preferably with an awful lot of letters in it. It's better than having letters after your name. If you've got OCDC, ACDC, ODHD or anything else. And it's absolutely bonkers, because what you need is somebody, whether that's a GP or whether it's your boss or whether it's your mum or your friend, who says to you, come on, we all have days when we don't feel like going to work, school, etc. But let's just get through today, go for a walk, stop sitting in front of the television, eat some healthy food, get some fresh air, and you'll feel better. If you haven't got those people around you, because everybody is not in the office. I mean, one of the big problems, I think, is for younger people who were, locked down, either from school or university or college, and then started work, in effect, remotely. They haven't learnt to be in that office environment where you go in and you see, Charlie comes in on a Monday morning with his arm in a sling. Yeah, he had a punch up in a pub, or he, twisted his ankle playing five-a-side football, or, somebody else who's dealing with an elderly parent or a sick child. You get used to the round of daily life. And I think they've missed out on that. So they've become like eggshells. And what we're doing, in effect, is enabling them to carry on in, if you like, this sort of cotton wool cushion. For what purpose? None.
Very quickly, Jim, the 2-child benefit cap, you were saying rightly, the polling shows that scrapping that particular policy would be unpopular. Actually, polling shows that people are in favour of that. But at the same time, you've got Labour MPs saying we want that scrapping because it's going to help us address child poverty. I think there's much better targeted ways of addressing child poverty, which is an issue that needs to be tackled. And big, obviously in favour of that. And as I said earlier, the free school meals being extended to those 100,000 children is good news. But I'm with the big majority of people in that poll. I don't think the 2-child benefit cap should be lifted. And again, Labour MPs need to give their heads a wobble. You're saying on the one hand, you don't want her to find £5 billion cuts from a huge welfare budget. You're actually saying to her then, and we want you, by the way, we don't want you to just not cut the welfare budget. We want to increase it by removing this cap. We also want you to change your mind on the winter fuel allowance. The only place that a lot of these Labour MPs think they can go for this additional spend is tax. And again, if you look at the evidence that is already emerging from the tax increases that is being made, the Treasury are projecting that the tax take may actually be lower than when Rachel Reeves made these changes. Why? Because as I always say to my colleagues in the Labour Party, once you start taxing people to the point where they think it is unfair, which tends to be the tipping point 50%, they will find a way to not pay that tax. We've seen a lot of non-doms move away from the country. We're seeing more and more people take tax advice, putting money into pension pots, putting money into things for the future in terms of their families and the kids. The people who ain't getting that cash at the Treasury, if you keep taxes around 45% level, and this was always Blair's argument, and to be fair, for most of his time in government, Brown's too, your tax take is bigger. And every statistic will show you that since the war. So, Jim, they're in a mess because they're not wanting to MPs, Labour MPs are not wanting to take on the big challenges, as Joe said, that need to be taken on. And a Labour government can actually do it easier than a Tory government often. You can make the arguments from a good place.
Yes. Well, I think, in terms of the parliamentary arithmetic, I think Starmer's safe. There will be a lot of howling and wailing from the left, but I think there are enough loyal Labour MPs to get this through at this stage, and to put the government's case, to people who are struggling with poverty. The minimum wage has gone up, mortgage rates have come down to some extent. Yeah. There have been easements on people's income arrangements over the last 12 months since Labour got in, you've put your finger on it. Rachel Reeves is in an extremely tight position, and whilst in an ideal world we might want to lift the 2-child benefit, it is not affordable, and they've got to be told that. But Starmer and Reeves are reluctant to sort of spell it out. But that's the fact of the matter, and we shall see. I mean, if it is lifted, then there's going to be as you've illustrated, a penalty for that in terms of implications for tax increases.
Yeah, it's another huge boost. Right, we're going to take a very short break and then come back and do 5 minutes on reform before we leave you on this fabulous Monday. So stay with us. We'll be back in a mo. Okay, welcome back to our Monday Downtown Den Politics podcast. And let's just look at the party that seems to exercise all of the media. So why should we be any different in this podcast? And that is Reform. They came third in the by-election that took place in Scotland last week. Labour won that by-election. Why I said at the start of this programme, to Jim's horror, that it was a good result for Labour, was that if you look at the headlines that have been surrounding the Labour Party, particularly in Scotland, the fact that a year into an unpopular government they could win that by-election from the SNP, I think is a reasonably good result. But all of the major parties, let's be fair, will be looking at that Reform result. I think they scored about 24% of the vote from
26
standing start. And the Tories were wiped out. So big problem for the Conservatives too. But the other big drama that happened last week in Reform was its chairman, who has largely been seen as professional, somebody who's getting the party together behind the scenes, professionalising it, as I say, Zia Youssef. He resigned apparently on the back of the new MP for Runcorn, Sarah Pochin, asking a ridiculous question of Keir Starmer about burqas. I'm not saying that issue isn't something that can be discussed and debated, but to use your first Prime Minister's question to put a point about an issue that isn't even in your own party's manifesto seemed a bit bizarre, not just to me, but obviously to Zia Youssef as well. Now, here's where I may surprise you. I think that Nigel Farage handled that resignation superbly well. Compare and contrast what is going on across the pond, which we will talk about tomorrow, where Trump has gone ballistic at Elon Musk, saying some of the things he said about his big, beautiful bill. Farage, very measured. Zia's done a great job. He's a great guy. He's been under an awful lot of pressure. He's been getting all sorts of online abuse, which apparently is true, to be fair to Nigel Farage, because not everything that guy says is true, but that is. And within 48 hours, he's persuaded him to come back, albeit in a different role. And I think that's good news for Reform, because I think if they'd have lost this guy permanently, it would have been saying to people, this party isn't serious. Every time somebody comes along with as high a profile as Farage, they leave because Farage just can't handle it. So over to you, Jim, because I think of the three of us, you're probably, and I don't mean this in a mean-spirited way or to suggest that you're a reform supporter, because you absolutely aren't. But you do, I think, have more truck with them than Joe and I, let's put it that way. So what do you make of the week that they've had?
Yeah, I just have I have more truck with them being covered on the BBC than you guys do, and you've illustrated why the BBC have continued to cover them. I mean, for Reform UK to get 26% in Scotland, a party heavily identified with Brexit, which has always been the toxic issue for Scottish voters, who seem to be overcoming their aversion to Brexit now to vote for reform. I think that was news. As far as Zia Youssef is concerned, you're right about the way Farage handled it. But of course, not all his team handled it like that. Aaron Banks, who's hotly tipped to be the candidate in the North East Somerset by-election, if that takes place, if the Labour MP there hasn't, Dan Norris is eased out, was saying, "Oh, we will pop the champagne corks that this guy's gone." So that you're absolutely right to contrast the way in which that should be handled. I mean, I think the truth of the matter is that he has been under a lot of abuse. I did think he found Sarah Pochin's question pretty offensive to a Muslim. And his arguments this morning about how he didn't think it was a dumb question to ask, entirely unconvincing. And he's come back in a different role. So I think the truth of the matter is he probably had been overworking. He did find Pochin's remark offensive. But the other issue is that apparently his personal relations with people in the office were very, very poor. Now, that may be because they just don't like change. About the NHS earlier on. But it's also, I think, that there is a tension in reform between some who lean towards the sort of incredibly embracing Tommy Robinson side of things, and you know, everything's qualified by using the word moderate, about having nothing to do with outright racists like that. I think there still are tensions in that party which are unresolved.
And listen, he's come back now. If he goes again, that could cause big problems for reform, right? So I think Farage has done a good job in the short term, but maybe still longer term problems for himself. The point you make there, Jim, about the 26%, and you know, this is a country that voted overwhelmingly against Brexit. Well, they did, but 38% of Scots voted for Brexit. So 26%, he's still 12 short of the people who voted for Brexit there. The Tory vote collapsed, and Kemi Badenoch is this week doing all sorts of things to try and recover the Tories' fortunes. So they're having a big review on ECHR, in terms of how that policy could potentially be, how that treaty could potentially be reformed. And she's announced today that immigrants coming to this country would not be eligible for benefits for 10 years if they came here. So that's another thing. So she's doing her best, as Kemi, to grab some headlines at long last. Long overdue, I would say. But Joe, our reform rightly now being seen as the official opposition?
I think they get disproportionate coverage, and I think it is utterly ridiculous. And I think, you know, personally, yeah, they did well in Scotland. But bear in mind that constituency was where Winnie Ewing, many, many years ago, made history and broke through the barriers to get the first nationalist MP into Westminster. And that was absolutely seismic for Scotland. And I think, you know, for the SNP, whose fortunes have waxed and waned under Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, you know, it's the end of them, one would say. Yes, it was a close squeak in for Labour, but it is significant for Labour. Reform at the moment, you know, they are all over the place, and there are already resignations from councillors recently elected who can't do it, didn't realise it was going to take so much time, can't do it because they've got other jobs, they've got other commitments. I think the whole Zia Youssef thing, I mean, personally, along with most women, I would suggest, think I was working a bit hard for the last 11 months. Yeah. Oh, get a life, sunshine. If you're working hard, don't go on Twitter. Say to Nigel, I'm really sorry, I've got to have a couple of weeks off. Don't go, I'm resigning, and then go, I'm sorry, I was a bit tired and overwrought. It's pathetic. You know, who is going to take that man seriously? Albeit that he has done a lot to professionalise the party, for sure. And as Jim rightly said, I think that's why it winds people up who don't like change and who don't like people who maybe say, hang on a minute, these are expense accounts, these sort of hours. No, we're going to be more professional. The Sarah Poachin thing I'm curious about, because as we all know, when you go to Prime Minister's questions, you don't know, unless you're the leader of the opposition, whether you are going to get called. So you would work it out amongst yourselves that whichever one of you from Reform or SNP or whoever is called, what is the question you're going to ask? Now, the question I'd like to know is, did the MPs know that she was going to raise the issue of the burqa and decided to keep Zia Youssef out of the loop, which in terms of communications is a dumb thing to do, to use his own words, because he would have been questioned about it? Or did she just go completely off-piste and bring up a question that she hadn't discussed with her colleagues? And is it something that Reform want to get out into the open? It's fine. Let's have a debate about it. Let's have a conversation about it. It won't be the first time, won't be the last time. But I think there is something, you know, did Richard Tice know? Did Nigel Farage know? Did Lee Anderson know? I don't know. It's a very odd way to behave, that you just stand up and you haven't told your colleagues what you're going to ask.
Well, I think the more I find out about Sarah Poachin, the more odd she becomes, to be honest. I mean, she was photographed with this mug of Keir Starmer wearing a burqa with two-tier Keir on, which is a trope that the hard right often use. So, yeah, we'll keep an eye on her. And I do wonder about Zia Youssef's unpopularity amongst some in Reform being more about where he's from rather than what he does. I'll just say it no stronger than that. As for the BBC's coverage of Reform, well, inevitably, and I'm surprised it's not happened before, a petition is now circulating on social media asking for the government to basically investigate whether Laura Kuenssberg, and who's the fella, is it Mason, the BBC
Chris
editor?
Mason is the distinguished political editor.
Whether basically whether the fucking paid up, signed up members of Reform, because it is ridiculous. I mean, you've got 73 Liberal Democrat MPs. As Joe pointed out last night, they've got far more councillors now than the Tories and Reform. Greens have got as many MPs, and there's no sign of them any Sunday on the Kuenssberg show. Question time the same. Somebody from Reform on the panel every single week now. It's absolutely scandalous. And hopefully this petition will be the wake-up call to Lisa and Andy to say, I'm going to get a grip of you buggers, because it's scandalous. Scandalous that Richard
Government
Tice
should direct the
was
BBC
given
in its
20
editorial
minutes.
policy, should it?
20 minutes. Well, I'll tell you what, Jim, it's still full of Tory placement, the BBC Board of Governors, and it should be sorted out. Now, what's that prick's name? Gibb. He's still around. You know, and the idea that the far right is being given as much publicity on the back of finishing third in a by-election. And can you imagine, by the way, Joe, the coverage and the mirth in which Laura Kuenssberg would have treated a Labour minister if Labour's chairman would have resigned on the back of a question that was being asked in Parliament, and then the following day come back and said, oh, I've been working too hard, so I've just come back now. Can you imagine?
Well,
and did you see the pathetic interview she did with Tice?
No, I did.
Dear me. Come on. I mean, if you're going to have them on, at least hold the feet to the fire and say, come on, you're having a laugh.
But I also have, I have really big questions about their editorial judgment that, you know, you lead it on Saturday at 6 o'clock, the 6 o'clock Radio 4 news bulletin with Zia Youssef returning to Reform. War is raging in Gaza. You know, there is Greta Thunberg on her way on a sailing vessel to Gaza. You've got Trump sending in the National Guard into Los Angeles. You know, there's a whole load of other stuff going on in the world. And the fact that somebody's had a little meltdown because they're a little bit overtired and then they've gone back because somebody's been nice to them is pathetic. It is not, in any standards, the lead story. And I'm sorry if, you know, I think Jim and I might have had an argument in the newsroom, but it was not the main story.
My argument is the accusation that Laura Kuenssberg did not rigorously interrogate Tice yesterday is plainly false. She went on and on about Reform's assertion in Scotland that the Scottish Labour leader had said he was going to favour Muslim people in public service in Scotland was not true. She asked that question 3 times. It's not fair to say she wasn't
Reform
rigorous.
love that debate, Jim. With due respect, Reform love that debate because that's what they want. It's a dog whistle, and it's fabulous that she's asking them that question. What she should have been asking him was, how can we take your party seriously when half of your councillors don't show up for council meetings and AGMs have had to be cancelled? Your chairman resigns one day and comes back the next, and you've just elected an MP in Runcorn who's asking a question that isn't even party policy. She wasn't scrutinising him on the issues that he doesn't want to be scrutinised about. If I was a Reform MP and I had their beliefs and their objectives, I would want Laura Kuenssberg or anybody else from the media to ask me about my policies on EDI. What do I think about racism? What do I think about? They're easy questions, Jim. They're the questions that Tice and Farage and Anderson want put into them. Why don't they ask them about why the 10 councils that they're running haven't been operating proper political meetings? Why don't they ask them about all the councillors that don't want to be councillors? Why don't they ask them about a chairman who's resigned one day and come back the next, what their reaction would be if that happened in the Conservative or Labour Party? She didn't put any of those questions to them, Jim, because they're the uncomfortable questions.
Well, I mean, you know, how long would the interview have been? I think the question
was 20 minutes. She had plenty of time.
Tice was not on for 20 minutes. But
James, she had plenty of time to have scrutinised him on those issues. But talking about dog whistles against the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland is exactly the place Tice wants to be in when he's talking to largely an English audience, and he's basically looking to continue to attract voters from that racist base.
Well, I think she exposed him for
being a racist,
making an assertion that wasn't true, and I think that was a valuable exercise. I suspect she hadn't been briefed about the non-attendance at council meetings. I mean, you do have a point here that there is a sort of Westminster agenda and there's what's going on in the rest of the country, and I suspect, as often is the case, things that are going on in local government which are really important don't get into the Westminster media village circulation, get into the heads of interviewers, and that is a valid point.
You're being very kind, Jim, but I'll just remind you, okay, Laura Kuenssberg may have not been briefed on what's happening with 10 councils in the country. Jim, what's the fella's name, O'Brien, on LBC? He has, because he's covered it. Me and you know about it. Joe knows about it. So I thought, somebody in the BBC might have given Laura a nudge. And Laura's usually good at briefing other people on stuff. Do you remember when she sent the questions to Boris Johnson?
That was a shame, and inadvertently copied in her colleagues. I mean, inadvertently copied him in.
Anyway, listen, we could just continue to have this debate between Joe and I and Jim. We're never going to agree on the